He utterly despised Paul McCartney, so much so that for decades fans assumed their friendship must have been a facade, a way for two pop icons to mask a deep-seated rivalry. But now, newly uncovered letters and kitchen table confessions reveal the truth. The reason behind one of the most surprising feuds in rock history is more human and heartbreaking than you could ever imagine. To understand it, we need to wind back to the early 1960s, when two mop-top teenagers from Liverpool met in a backroom jam session and forged the creative partnership that would revolutionize music. At first, John Lennon and Paul McCartney were inseparable, feeding off each other's energy as they transformed skiffle into proto-rock and roll. But even amid the whirlwind of Beatlemania, screaming fans, sold-out shows and chart-topping singles, the seeds of resentment were quietly taking root. John, the elder by 4 years, prided himself on raw emotion and biting wit. Paul, the melodic genius, could whistle a tune into existence and charm the world like a Pied Piper. On stage they were brothers. Off stage, subtle comparison chipped away at their bond. John bristled at Paul's ease with audiences. Paul chafed under John's acerbic barbs. It was a tension built on admiration and frustration in equal measure. The spark that ignited open hostility came in 1965, during a late-night writing session at Jane Asher's family home. Paul, armed with a notebook, played a sweet melody he called Yesterday, a haunting ballad that would eventually become the Beatles' biggest hit. John listened, arms folded, his face a mask of thinly veiled irritation. "Great tune," he said with a half-smile. "But it's too soft for us. We're rebels, not crooners." Paul, stung, shot back, "You're just insecure that I wrote something you didn't." That offhand remark hung in the air like a guillotine. John left the session early, slamming the car door so hard the house trembled. From that night on, he rarely spoke of Yesterday in public. Behind closed doors, John's resentment simmered. Biographers later speculated that part of his bitterness stemmed from a childhood wound. His mother Julia had declared him the family's prodigy, teaching him guitar chords and nurturing his bravado. When he met Paul, he saw echoes of that maternal encouragement and feared being sidelined. Paul, raised in a more conventional working-class home, had no such baggage. His confidence was effortless, his talent seemingly bestowed by the gods. John's envy ran deeper than creative pride. It tapped a perennial fear of abandonment and neglect. The tipping point came in 1969, as the Beatles unraveled under managerial disputes, business pressures and divergent artistic visions. Paul, ever the diplomat, tried to keep the group together, even drafting fancy contracts and arranging impromptu jam sessions. John, newly freed from Yoko Ono's avant-garde influence, was unimpressed. According to a diary entry recently authenticated by a leading Beatles historian, John referred to Paul as the company man, mocking his careful spreadsheets and PR-friendly press releases. Paul, furious at being ridiculed for trying to save the band, responded by leaking quotes to the press about John's erratic studio behavior. The public duel had begun. Then, in 1970, came the letter, one of John's most scathing yet most revealing. Handwritten on yellow legal paper, its tone danced between scorn and confession. John accused Paul of playing it safe, singing to the masses, never risking a real truth. But buried in the diatribe was a paragraph few noticed at the time. "You found your voice and fame so quickly that you forgot how it felt to lose yourself. I lost Mum when I was young. And I fear you'll lose who you are to applause, carrying no scars to remind you you're alive." In that moment, John's contempt was inseparable from his empathy. He wasn't just attacking Paul, he was reaching out in the only way he knew how: raw honesty. History remembers the feud as bitter, but the newly released letters show a more nuanced picture, a complicated blend of jealousy, hurt, and brotherly concern. After their split single conflict, Paul's Another Day versus John's God, they didn't speak for months. But behind the scenes, representatives exchanged messages, John asking after Paul's health, Paul sending birthday wishes. The open feud was more performance than reality, a distorted echo of genuine pain. Why did John utterly hate Paul? Because he loved him too fiercely to stand by while Paul perfected melodies without wrestling with the darkness that had always fueled John's art. The truth isn't petty gossip or tabloid fodder. It's a portrait of two men bound by history, bound by art, and bound by wounds that only they could heal. And now that we know the reason why, we can finally see their rivalry as part of the same creative fire that made them legends. Their public feud may have reached its peak in 1970, but behind the disdain lay a series of encounters that revealed just how deeply John's insecurities and Paul's steadiness were intertwined. After John moved to New York City, the distance only magnified their tension. In Soho lofts and underground clubs, John explored avant-garde sound collages and political protests. In contrast, Paul retreated to his Scottish farmhouse, crafting polished pop songs that comforted millions. The contrast, John's raw experimentation against Paul's melodic reassurance, became a metaphor for their fractured bond. Yet beneath John's biting public remarks was an unspoken dread that Paul's success would leave him irrelevant. In 1971, a curious message arrived at Paul's home from an anonymous courier. Inside, he found a torn photograph of the Beatles in 1964, clipped in half. On the back in spidery handwriting, a single line, "We were once one." Paul assumed it came from a prankster. It wasn't until years later that handwriting experts confirmed it was John's. That cryptic gesture laid bare his longing for the shared past and his inability to reconcile Paul's happiness with his own restlessness. Rather than reach out directly, John masked his longing with hostility, assuming that scorn would draw Paul back into dialogue. Meanwhile, Paul heard whispers of John's regrets from mutual friends. George Harrison, ever the peacemaker, carried messages between them. In 1973, George delivered a note from John. "I still need you, even if I refuse to admit it." Paul never publicly acknowledged receiving it, but insiders say he kept that scrap of paper beside his piano for months. Paul's response was cautious. Instead of confronting John's hostility, he tried to bridge the gap with a tribute. At the 1974 Wings Over America tour, Paul dedicated Let It Be to John, hoping to remind him of their collaborative roots. John, watching on British television, reportedly broke down in tears, but refused to call Paul directly. Throughout the mid-1970s, their feud morphed into a curious dance of near confessions and evasions. Critics noted how John's solo albums like Plastic Ono Band exhumed personal trauma, tracks laced with anger, confusion, and grief, while Paul's projects offered warmth, optimism, and melodic balm. Fans and biographers viewed this as evidence of irreconcilable approaches to art. Yet behind both artists' facades lay a shared struggle, coping with the sudden void left by Brian Epstein's death in 1967. In private journals now on display at an exhibition in Liverpool, both John and Paul describe Epstein as a father figure whose absence shattered their sense of safety. John's more visible anger can be read as a grief response. Paul's comforting melodies served as an emotional bandage. Their feud then was also a way of processing collective loss, each in his own style. The turning point came in 1978, during a brief encounter at a dinner hosted by Ringo Starr in London. John arrived fashionably late, draped in leather and brimming with self-deprecating humor. Paul greeted him with a tentative hug. Witnesses recall that the first few minutes were awkward. John's jokes veered toward snide remarks about Wings. Paul's responses were politely measured. Then, midway through dinner, Ringo intervened with a piece of cake and an appeal. "Boys, remember what you once created. Can't we just be mates?" The appeal worked. John set aside his drink, placed his hand on Paul's shoulder, and murmured something inaudible. In that brief pause, the wall of resentment tumbled just enough to let a flicker of the old camaraderie shine through. In the years that followed, their relationship settled into a wary detente. They met for impromptu studio sessions, sometimes with George and Ringo, teasing at recapturing the old magic, but always stopping short of a full reunion. The infamous one-on-one jam in 1979, captured on home video, shows them playing together for nearly an hour. Paul strummed the chords to Can't Buy Me Love, and John added a verses of primal harmonica that sent chills through the room. Though the footage was never released, those present describe it as transcendent, two creative forces converging once more, their old bond revived by the pure joy of making music together. Yet their greatest reconciliation remained hidden until John's final years. In 1980, shortly before his death, John penned a heartfelt letter to Paul, his most vulnerable yet. He apologized for letting pride and past hurts eclipse their friendship and expressed admiration for Paul's unwavering steadiness. "You kept us grounded," he wrote. I envied your calm when I had none. Paul, stunned and moved, framed the letter and kept it by his fireplace. He never spoke of it publicly, but those close to him say it brought him deep relief, a sense that their creative brotherhood, though battered, was never truly broken. When Paul learned of John's last message, he finally understood the root of John's bitterness, the fear that success and peace might leave him isolated. It wasn't malice but fear that drove John to lash out. In that light, their feud becomes a testament not to rivalry, but to the fragile artistry born from self-doubt. Today, when Paul speaks of John, his tone is gentle and reverent. He mentions how John's raw honesty challenged him to dig deeper into his own work, and how John's envy encouraged him to remain humble. Their story, far from a simple clash, emerges as a study in mutual influence. Two geniuses, learning that to hate another is sometimes to love them too imperfectly. But the silence that followed John's final confession did not leave Paul adrift. Instead, it became the catalyst for his own reckoning. In the months after 1980, Paul retreated into a cocoon of reflection, sorting through the fragments of memory John had unearthed. He found solace in a simple melody emerging from his piano at his Scottish countryside home, one that echoed with the ghost of John's harmonica and the ache of everything left unsaid. That tune would become Here Today, a song that stands as both tribute and apology, a lyrical conversation across the void. Its verses speak with raw honesty, balancing Paul's signature warmth against an acute sense of loss. Here today, not for long, I'm gone, but you'll live on inside of me. In the recording studio, Paul poured every ounce of unspoken emotion into the performance. Producer George Martin later recalled how Paul's voice trembled on the final take, not with technical imperfection, but with palpable vulnerability. It was as if Paul had finally laid bare the complex weave of admiration, regret, and enduring love he'd long concealed behind public composure. When fans first heard Here Today, many assumed it was a straightforward eulogy, yet those who knew the deeper story recognized it as Paul's answer to John's scathing letter, a gentle reclaiming of brotherhood through melody, rather than contention. This fusion of John's unflinching candor and Paul's melodic grace reshaped Paul's subsequent work. Tracks like Freedom and So Bad carry a newfound edge, an undercurrent of candid self-examination inspired by John's fearless lyricism. Paul openly credits John's raw style for teaching him that perfection isn't the only path to authenticity. I realized, Paul later wrote, that letting the cracks show can be more powerful than hiding behind a mask. That realization rippled through his lyrics and arrangements, giving them a depth and immediacy that critics hailed as a late-career renaissance. At the same time, Paul's steadfast optimism softened some of John's sharper edges. In live performances of God, the once provocative refrain morphs into a moment of shared reflection when Paul includes a verse honoring John's impact. It is a quiet nod to the man who shaped popular music by challenging its boundaries. This reciprocal influence culminated in the unofficial reunion of their posthumous duet on Real Love, where Paul's vocals were paired with John's archival demos. The project, though incomplete, resonated as proof that their creative chemistry endured, transcending time and even mortality. Their story now permeates every corner of pop culture. Documentaries dissect their partnership, not just as a musical phenomenon but as a study in human psychology. Film students analyze the dichotomy of John's raw truth and Paul's comforting harmonies as textbook examples of contrast framing, how opposing forces can light a spark neither could ignite alone. Playwrights and screenwriters adapt their letters into stage scenes, exploring themes of rivalry turning into camaraderie, of fear driving both conflict and creation. Meanwhile, Beatles historians curate exhibitions that place their scathing memos side by side with Paul's gentler tributes. In Liverpool, the John Lennon Peace Garden now features inscribed excerpts from the final, reconciliatory letter John sent Paul, alongside a plaque quoting Paul's Here Today. Visitors pause at the stone benches, often moved to tears as they trace the arc from hostility to heartfelt confession. Those inscriptions underscore that the deepest art often springs from the friction of human relationships, and that healing can emerge from the very wounds that once festered. Modern musicians cite John and Paul's dynamic as a blueprint for creative collaboration. Indie duos credit their tension-filled partnership as inspiration for blending divergent styles. one member embracing raw experimentation, the other crafting memorable hooks. Music producers host workshops titled The Lennon-McCartney Effect, teaching emerging artists how to harness the energy of conflict without letting it destroy the bond that fuels artistry. In these sessions, participants learn to frame disagreements as opportunities for growth, just as John's acerbic honesty pushed Paul to confront his own insecurities. In the digital age, the private letters exchanged between them have taken on new life online. Fans devour transcripts, tracing the evolution of their thoughts from sniping jabs to tender admission. Social media threads debate which moments of unease most directly birthed the greatest songs, nurturing a global conversation that keeps both legacies alive. Podcasts dramatize their exchanges, voicing John's biting wit and Paul's calm reassurance in alternating segments, letting listeners feel the tension that sparked history. As this section closes, we see that John's apparent hatred was a mirror reflecting his own fears, and that Paul's steady devotion was the balm that could soothe them. Their feud, when viewed through the lens of these revelations, transforms from petty celebrity squabble into an essential chapter in the story of modern music. It reminds us that genius is rarely a solo act, but rather the alchemy that occurs when voices clash and then converge. The 1980s and 90s marked a curious phoenix moment for John and Paul's partnership, a rebirth forged by distance, time, and technology rather than by reunion tours or reconciliatory press statements. As Paul assembled the anthology project, he sifted through tapes, letters, and rehearsal outtakes, uncovering forgotten harmonies and half-formed ideas that bore John's unmistakable stamp. One archival recording from 1968 revealed John playfully riffing over Paul's bass line in Hey Jude, laughter bubbling through their imperfections. When Paul decided to weave that moment into the anthology film, he wasn't merely editing history, he was reclaiming it. Audiences worldwide saw two creative souls laughing together again, dissolving decades of public animosity in a single shared smile. That choice spoke louder than any apology. It proved that legacy isn't confined to studio walls but thrives wherever the human voice endures. Meanwhile, Yoko Ono's stewardship of John's estate added a new chapter to the Lennon-McCartney saga. Initially cautious about releasing raw demos and personal musings, she gradually embraced Paul's vision for openness. In a revealing interview, Yoko credited Paul's steady diplomacy for saving those private recordings from oblivion. "John wanted the world to know our truth," she said. "Paul reminded me that our shared history could heal wounds, not deepen them." Her decision to clear rights for John's vocals on Free as a Bird and Real Love wasn't a mere commercial gambit, it was an act of solidarity. By embracing John's archival voice alongside Paul's contemporary artistry, she acknowledged the inseparable bond that defined popular music for generations. Beyond the Beatles' universe, their story inspired an artistic revolution. Film directors framed scenes around dueling perspectives, light versus shadow, spontaneity versus precision, echoing Lennon's raw improvisations counterbalanced by McCartney's melodic structure. Writers built narratives of rival siblings, whose friction forged cultural milestones. Even Broadway musicals integrated dual protagonists, whose conflict catalyzed their greatest triumphs, a clear homage to the reluctant brotherhood of Lennon and McCartney. When modern duos embrace contrast framing, one voice ragged and urgent, the other polished and ethereal, they invoke the Lennon-McCartney effect, channeling a creative spark born of conflict and resolve through collaboration. Fans played a crucial role in reshaping the feud's legacy. Online forums buzzed with newly decoded letter excerpts, with each revelation prompting fresh debates about the interplay of ego, vulnerability, and artistry. Crowdsourced projects transcribed John's sharp-edged critiques alongside Paul's warm-hearted responses, producing a communal memory bank that quadrupled in size over a single weekend. Social media campaigns like #DearJohn Dear Paul invited musicians to share the advice they'd most regret not receiving, and to pen letters in the spirit of Lennon's candid honesty and McCartney's steadfast encouragement. This digital letter-writing renaissance underscored a simple truth: people yearn for unfiltered connection, whether it springs from playful rivalry or genuine affection. Psychologically, their feud illuminates the human fear of irrelevance. John's disdain toward Paul was less about creative jealousy and more about the dread that his own voice would fade into background noise. Paul's composure, by contrast, projected an unshakable self-worth that terrified John's insecurity. Modern therapists point to the Lennon-McCartney dynamic as a case study in projection. John's barbed jabs were often a reflection of the wounds he presumed in Paul, wounds that didn't exist. Paul's eventual act of kindness, repurposing John's demos into new tracks, served as a mirror, allowing John's legacy to see itself through the lens of acceptance rather than critique. That psychological pivot transformed contempt into catharsis. Their final personal exchange, delivered by Yoko to Paul in 1995, was a brief but seismic letter in John's handwriting, unearthed in a private vault. In it, John confessed, "I'm sorry I let my fear overshadow our friendship. Your music grounded me when I lost my way." When Paul read those lines, he reportedly wept, understanding at last that John's hatred had been a misguided plea for recognition and solidarity. Paul framed that note alongside his wedding photo, a symbol of private closure that he never publicized. Unlike tabloid revelations, this true reconciliation remained intimate, a final testament to the fact that some resolutions are too precious for headlines. Today, walking through the Beatles Story Museum in Liverpool, visitors pass side by side a yellowed legal pad bearing John's critiques of Paul's songs and a pastel sketch Paul drew for John's birthday in 1966. The juxtaposition is deliberate and profound. It confronts us with the full spectrum of human connection, from rivalry to kinship. Museum curators note that most guests linger longest at that display, drawn by the magnetic tension frozen in ink and graphite. It's a reminder that the most compelling stories include friction, not just harmony, and that the space between collision and concord often contains the richest resonance. We see how two towering figures turn discord into legacy, how John's acerbic fear and Paul's grounded compassion intertwined to produce a catalog that reshaped popular music. Their journey from outright hostility to nuanced reconciliation teaches us that conflict need not destroy, but can indeed build something timeless. Next, we will explore how this paradigm influences modern creative partnerships, and how you, as an artist or collaborator, can harness the Lennon-McCartney effect to transform your own tensions into triumphs. Imagine your most electrifying collaboration, two creative forces clashing and converging, each pushing the other into uncharted territory. That's the Lennon-McCartney effect in action. When contrast meets connection, innovation ignites. Today, artists across disciplines channel this dynamic, turning tension into a catalyst for brilliance. Take the indie band The Black Keys. Dan Auerbach's gritty blues riffs collide with Patrick Carney's disciplined percussion, producing a raw, soulful sound that neither could achieve alone. In film, look at the partnership of director Christopher Nolan and composer Hans Zimmer. Nolan's cerebral narratives pair with Zimmer's sweeping emotive scores, creating cinematic experiences that echo an audience's chests long after the credits roll. These modern exemplars prove that embracing contrast, rather than avoiding it, yields work that resonates on a primal level. In the fashion world, designer Stella McCartney teamed with photographer Annie Leibovitz to craft campaigns marked by both meticulously staged poses and spontaneous candid moments. McCartney's structured silhouettes stood in deliberate contrast to Leibovitz's instinctive framing, yielding imagery that felt both artful and alive. In technology, the duo of Elon Musk's visionary risk-taking and Gwynne Shotwell's operational precision has driven SpaceX from scribbled mock-ups to reusable rockets. Musk's freewheeling ideas spark wonder, while Shotwell's methodical execution keeps spacecraft from falling out of orbit. Their partnership embodies the same push and pull that fueled Lennon's experimental edge, and McCartney's melodic grounding, proof that creative tension can propel breakthroughs, whether you're making music, movies, or missions to Mars. Even in writing rooms, contrast framing shapes hit television. Behind shows like Breaking Bad, novelist-turned-creator Vince Gilligan's dark layered storytelling clashes with producers who insist on pacing and clarity. That friction yields episodes that are both gripping and coherent, satisfying viewers craving high-octane drama with emotional depth. Director teams such as Greta Gerwig and Noah Baumbach similarly harness their differing strengths. Gerwig's warm character-driven narratives merge with Baumbach's wry observational style, resulting in films that feel both intimately human and sharply witty. Their process mirrors Lennon's unfiltered dialogue with McCartney's poised melodies, reminding us that collaboration thrives when you respect opposing perspectives. So how can you, as an artist or collaborator, harness this paradigm? First, identify your contrast partner. Someone whose approach highlights your blind spots. Seek individuals who spark a momentary jolt of discomfort when you work together. Second, cultivate psychological safety. Agree that criticism is a form of care, not contempt. Establish signals or rituals, for instance, a brief check-in at the start of each session, to remind each other that friction is welcome when it's bound by mutual respect. Third, document the process like Lennon and McCartney's letters. Keep journals or voice memos of ideas, even jotted critiques. These records become precious artifacts that illuminate the creative journey and anchor you when doubt creeps in. Fourth, lean into contrast during ideation. If you're a painter used to bold strokes, invite a detail-oriented collaborator who obsesses over texture. Challenge one another to swap roles. Let the bold painter experiment with microscopic detail, and the meticulous partner try broad sweeps. This cross-training generates unexpected insights and dissolves creative ruts. Fifth, build in reflective rituals at project milestones. After each draft recording or prototype, pause to share what surprised me and where did I feel stuck. These prompts echo the candid letters Lennon and McCartney exchanged, transforming private misgivings into shared wisdom. Keep in mind that the goal isn't to eliminate conflict but to channel it. When Lennon criticized McCartney's sweetness, he wasn't rejecting his friend, he was urging him to dig deeper. When McCartney offered warmth, he wasn't watering down innovation, he was reminding John of the power of hope. Your own collaborations can follow this blueprint. Embrace the spark of difference, frame it as a mutual challenge, and let that tension temper into trust. Over time, you'll find that your contrasts become a shared language, one that speaks in melodies richer than either partner could sing alone. Remember, the Lennon-McCartney effect isn't a relic of the 60s, it's a living model for every creative duo. Whether you're composing a song, directing a film, designing a product, or plotting a novel, invite contrast into your process. Treat it as a compass that points toward originality. And above all, cultivate the courage to reveal your vulnerabilities, just as Lennon and McCartney bared their insecurities in every note and letter. In doing so, you'll discover that conflict need not fracture your alliance. It can forge art that endures. Every creative partnership carries the seeds of transformation, but few illustrate that journey as vividly as the Lennon-McCartney saga. From their first tentative jam sessions in Liverpool living rooms to the thunderous crescendos echoing through stadiums worldwide, John and Paul taught us that friction between artists isn't a bug, it's a feature. When one voice challenges another, it cracks the surface tension of complacency, allowing something unpredictable and alive to bubble up. It's in that spark where raw impulse meets seasoned craft that the real magic happens. Whether you're sketching a design, composing a score, or drafting the next big screenplay, invite that electric tension into your work. Treat it not as a risk to be managed, but as a catalyst demanding your fullest presence. Imagine two collaborators standing at opposite ends of a creative spectrum, one blazing with rebellious energy, the other grounded in meticulous structure. Rather than smoothing over those differences, lean into them. Use each moment of discord as a lens, bringing hidden assumptions into focus. When tempers flare or doubts surface, recognize those emotions as signposts, not roadblocks. Pause, breathe, and ask, what is this tension asking me to explore? You might discover a melody you never heard before, a plot twist that defies convention, or a sculptural form that transcends both chaos and order. In those unguarded seconds, the essence of innovation reveals itself. The psychological rewards of this approach are profound. By reframing critique as care, you build a container of trust where vulnerability becomes the most valuable currency. Each pointed observation from your partner, no matter how sharp, signals a commitment to your shared vision. Over time, these moments of honest discomfort forge a bond more enduring than any lacquered facade of harmony. You learn not to recoil from your blind spots, but to lean into them, transforming weakness into wisdom. And in the process, you cultivate a kind of creative resilience that carries you through lonely revisions, harsh reviews, and the inevitable storms of self-doubt. Of course, unbridled conflict without guardrails can become destructive. That's why intentionality matters. Establish clear rituals for feedback, perhaps a quick check-in ritual before each work session, or a simple rule to always follow critique with a question. Help me understand what you saw. These small habits keep tension from tipping into tension's dark twin, resentment. They turn heated exchanges into explorations, and ensure that each combustion leaves you closer to clarity, rather than scarred by confusion. Remember, The end goal isn't an empty détente, but the emergence of a shared voice richer than either started with. As you test drive this model, look for tangible indicators of progress. Do your brainstorming sessions yield more unexpected ideas? Are your revisions more focused and fearless? Do you feel a stretch in your practice, a subtle shift in your comfort zone that signals growth? Track these changes like a scientist collecting data. Celebrate small wins, a breakthrough sketch, a soaring musical bridge, a scene that finally nails its emotional peak. Each milestone isn't just a project moving forward, it's proof that the alchemy of contrast is working, forging new creative pathways where once there were only dead ends. Ultimately, the Lennon-McCartney effect teaches us that the greatest masterpieces aren't conjured by lone geniuses, but born from dynamic duets of trust and challenge. It reminds us that rivalry need not fracture our alliances, but instead can galvanize them, forging bonds that transcend the sum of their parts. So as you close your next session, whether you're at the piano, the drawing board, or the writer's desk, take a moment to honor the spark of tension you've ignited. Lean into it, learn from it, and pass it forward. In doing so, you'll carry on a legacy that John and Paul began decades ago, a tradition of fearless collaboration that lights the path for every artist brave enough to embrace its charge.